Okay, so this is my continuation of my commentary and reading on Proverbs chapter 21. This is verse 9 that I will be beginning with here. It is better to dwell in a corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Now, before I begin, I think it's worth mentioning that these verses, some of them seem quite straightforward, some perhaps even superficial. Others, I think, are quite deep, potentially profound. Many of them are profound, if not most of them are profound. One of the things that I found so far on this journey of really diving into the verses in detail, unpacking them, sort of like a loaded spring that has so much potential within it, is that even the simplest verses have something to offer beneath the surface. And that what at once seems simple can be taken to quite lofty heights or deep depths. And as I say that, I consider about all of the things in life that are that way. There are many things about statements that people make or their behaviors that we can truly analyze in quite great detail. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for this type of clinical eye. However, in matters such as this, where we are concerned about piety, where I am concerned about the expansion of mind, the intimacy and connectedness to my soul, to my inner being, I think that clinical eye and the discerning mind are necessary to approach these verses. It is better to dwell in a corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Now, this verse almost seems kind of humorous. We can imagine in our popular culture the comedians of the day making comments about their wives or their girlfriends, whatever, perhaps about women in general, just a playful jab at their other half, the people that they truly love. And it's not something that is to be seen as negative, although there is this negative aspectual component. And as I've just finished in the last episode talking about marginality, the irony in there, and that marginality that exists within the center, I think makes it funny, because it is truly that the person that is taking the jab at the other is somebody that loves the person. Now, there are other ways, other reasons for which this can be humorous, sort of in a dark, twisted sense, but we need not go there. So let's pick apart what is being said here. It is better to dwell in a corner of the housetop. Housetop being perhaps a flat roof of an ancient home. Now, there are a few things, I think, in the first part of this verse that we have to keep in mind here. The idea of dwelling, the space that is being occupied, and then the location that is being occupied. Now, to dwell somewhere, I think, is no simple matter. One's dwelling has a lot to do with their connectedness, of their sense of home, their belonging. It's the place, almost like an axis of rotation, around which they revolve, that is the place that they return to for rest, for nourishment, for leisure, some of the most meaningful experiences are had in the places in which we dwell. Not to make the sacrifice of one's inner dwelling and to move it to a place that is less than, that is superficial, and to occupy a small component of that superficiality is interesting. It's quite the statement. It's almost why it's almost humorous. Because how bad could the woman be? Such that even in a wide house, where there are plenty of places to be separated from, this brawling nature makes it unable to avoid the conflict. Now, I think there's an assumption here that we should not put aside, that this assumption, if these two are living together, it is likely that they are joined in union, that they are married. And with that, I think, comes, again, certain assumptions about the way that they ought to be together in a space. Now, of course, relationships are complex, and it's not necessarily the case that because they are in unity that they are always going to be in agreement, or that there's never going to be conflict. Of course, there will be some conflict. But we are considering here a matter of degree. This adjective of brawling, we think of a fight or a quarrel, noisy, rough. For I think we should ask, within this context of unity, what does it mean for one half or one partner to seek this conflict, or to seek the fight? What does it mean when we have when we say the expression, to pick a fight? In some sense, we are saying that this party, this other half, is choosing the contrary. There's a lot of different language that we can use here, but choosing the contrary, I'm reminded of verse 6, the getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. Verse 8, the way of man is froward and strange, but as for the pure, his work is right. In that, I had come to some understanding that there is a vast expanse that exists that connects behaviors and the moral underpinning, perhaps we can say, that is associated with it. Sometimes, oftentimes, this is beneath our conscious awareness. It certainly is not to say that because it is not within our conscious awareness that it doesn't exist. Surely there must be some standard, some high standard for which we can compare our behaviors and actions to. If it did not exist, then the rule of law would not be feasible. It would not be possible. And so again, to return to this woman that has this brawling capacity, that wishes to pick a fight, wishes to be contrary. She is a part of a union, and yet her behavior, what she desires, is disunity, is to pull away, is to constantly be against, in conflict with, that other half, or her partner. Now, I have had the experience of witnessing a relationship when I was younger, of this sort of unfortunate dynamic in which one half or one party is constantly devolving into the contrary, that seems to, on some level, be desirous of the disunity. And yet, as I mentioned before, it seems as though the behavior of the person is not necessarily known to them, or perhaps their behavior is known to them, but the moral underpinning, the consequences of their behavior are not necessarily known to them. if I were to ask, or go back in time and to ask this person if they felt that what they were doing was leading to the disunity of the relationship or of the marriage, I am uncertain whether this person would say yes. It is certainly possible that somebody is capable of such foresight, but I think often, and certainly in my experience, not just with these matters, but in terms of my own behavior, there are many things that I do and say that perhaps in the moment I'm not really considering their consequences. But I can tell afterwards, by hindsight, that what I had done was not the right thing to do in the moment, and that the consequences for that action will arise. And I have come to understand what the consequences, or at least the potential for the consequences, are. Now, thankfully, I think most of us are prudent enough to temper ourselves such that repeated behavior doesn't lead to extreme negative consequences. Or in the case of verse 6, vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. Quite a severe and extreme example. But for consistency's sake, and for those that are contrary by nature, or perhaps in my example here about the observation that I had in youth of the bipolar personality, that there is this unfortunate consistency of antagonism that exists in some of these people, and it makes it very difficult to live with them. And so I'd like to continue the discussion about the margin, or about the periphery, the peripheral, or of the strange. As I mentioned in the last episode, it can both be the case that the center can be positive or negative. Negative in the sense that the center can be consumed by what ought to be at the margin. And such as that happens, there is the destruction of the center. Likewise, at the margin, there can be elements of goodness that ought to be at the center. And if they are shoved to the margin, there is this profound sense of disunity, loss of belonging. Perhaps domicide is something that can happen, the loss of home. On the other hand, you can have the negative sense of the margin, or the periphery, in which that which ought to be excluded from the center, or the pieces of true stability, like evil, wickedness, forms of different types of corruption. All of these things are meant to be pushed and placed at the periphery. Now, it is not as though these things cannot exist. I think their existence within nature and within the experience of man is just something as a part of our reality. And because they are part of reality, I don't think it's feasible to try to perhaps not to try, but to think and to consider that the margin and the periphery will, by our hands, be dissolved. I think in some sense it exists so that we can see the center more clearly, or rather, that we can see it, and such that we can see it, we are allowed to see the center more clearly. I don't want to be too self-centric. Now, what's happening in this verse is an interesting illustration for which the brawling woman is consuming the center. We have two different symbols here. We have the symbol of the unity within that marriage, in which the woman, by her behavior, is attempting to disintegrate it. Now, it is a whole. It is not something that can be easily broken. Let's say in a traditional society in which this is just not something that is acceptable, rather than our own society, this verse, I think, would lose a little bit of weight. but in the traditional society, in which the whole is much more of a sturdy concept, and that breaking that vow and that bond is quite severe. So we have that symbol and that aspect. We also have the symbol and the aspect of the contrary, the strange, the marginal, the antagonistic, entering into the center, entering into the home. Now she is within the wide house, and her antagonism is to such a degree, her behavior for disunity, her want for disunity, is to such a degree that it forces the marginality to the center, and that marginality at the center is inherently this sort of expansive, repulsive, perhaps is a better word, force. And because of this repulsive force, the man, the husband, is forced onto the roof, into a small corner of the roof. And therein, that detail almost is humorous. It's a strange analogy, a strange illustration. It's strange because it's difficult to imagine the degree to which this person or this woman's behavior must be such that a man no longer wishes to dwell beneath the roof and in the security and comfort of the home, but rather be exposed to the elements on the roof in a small corner. Within this illustration of the man, we are, as I had mentioned briefly, he is restricted to a particular location. Then within that location, a particular aspect. So he's reduced in terms of his home capacity, the binding to that place. So there is that marginalization to the roof, and then there's the further marginalization to the corner. It's almost as if we are being prompted to consider the emphasis of that marginalization. And this is all happening within the hands, within the grasp of a marriage, within the unity of two people. And I think this was a hard bit for me to understand, that exact relationship between the strange and the marginal and the whole. Because it is not just the case that the marginal exists independent from the whole, or the marginal exists outside of the whole, perhaps we can say, but rather that there is the aspect of the marginal outside of the whole, and then there is the aspect of the marginal within the whole. It's this nested layer, Russian doll aspect of our experience. And that at some level we can analyze the true margin, but the readily identifiable margin, which is, we can say, in terms of an ancient city, that which lies outside of the city walls. And in that case we have we have a lot of things. Not all of it's negative. We have the farmers, we have the suburban population, but we also have the thieves, the thugs. We have the danger that can come from another city, a potential rival army, for example. But also within the city gates, within the city walls, we have that robbery, that thuggery. We can have corruption. We could have danger from within. We can have treason. We can have a tyranny. And so there's this interesting interplay between that margin and the center. And it depends on what level we choose to analyze it. But I suppose what's interesting at this point is to perhaps further reflect on the purpose of examining a particular level or layer of either the center or of the margin. And in this particular case, since we are talking about the home, and we are talking about the marriage, we're talking about a unity between two people, a type of bondedness that is meant to facilitate an expansive experience. Again, not all of it's going to be positive. Some of it, a lot of it, surely will be difficult. It will be within that marginal sphere, trying to determine where by the infrastructure that is the conflict, how to resolve it and to push the issues out towards the margin as they ought to be, as they come up within. And what we see here is an absolute failure of the institution or of that unity to hold. And it's not just because the marriage still exists, so there is that unity to some level. At that level holds, but at another level its purpose, its function fails, such that the marginality, the strange, has invaded the center, and now because of it these two people can't even live in the same room or in the same house. One has to live on the roof and the other is within, even though there's plenty of space for them to be independent of each other. Now further, I would like to say, building off of that previous point, is that we as human beings, we certainly do not know everything. We don't know every potential conflict. We don't know every potential situation for which we would even understand what we don't know. There are cases, surely, that we do understand things that we don't know, and there are situations for which we understand things that we do know, at least to a relative degree of security. But within all of that, the margin that exists within the center, and I talk purely from the human standpoint, that because of his limited experience and his limited perception, that marginality will always exist. The unknown, the strange, the peripheral. One of the characteristics I think that we can consider as part of the periphery or of the margin is falsehood. It could be deception. But falsehood isn't necessarily negative, because if we are desirous of the truth, if our will is oriented towards the good, falsehood, if it comes to us, is but an experience of learning. And often we find this at the center. There's every day when I encounter something in my professional life, there are many instances in which falsehood comes up, which I am brought to conflict over something that I don't know or I ought to know, or somebody is relying on me to know something. And I do my best to reason towards something that is true and towards something that is supported by something. And there are various ways by which a person can support what they believe that they know, by evidence, by observation, by experience, by demonstration perhaps, by experimentation. And all of this is to determine what exactly should be at the margin. But almost like a volcanic vent at the bottom of the ocean, or just perhaps a volcano in general, this constant bubbling up of this molten surface, of the unknown that is constantly, I'm not sure if I could say it's tempting us or prompting us or inviting us to have the ability of mind to perceive and to make sense of that unknown come to be. And again, in that process, it is the unknown that makes itself known. And it's a strange thing to say, that something is unknown, but certainly we can say that there are things that we don't know. And there are things that we can be quite specific about that we don't know. I can outline a specific very specific math problem that has a solution, and yet I don't know what that solution is, or I don't know how to find the solution. And one has to wonder all of the ways that this comes into understanding, into awareness, that the unknown is making itself known, not in terms of its whole, or its unity, or the principles that make it truly, or safely perhaps, understood, because to what degree do we really understand something? I'm not saying that understanding is impossible, but it's certainly a tricky matter, because we can understand things at various levels. And as we go deeper and deeper into those levels, we understand things more and more. They become more and more secure, more and more principled. But all the same, the reality that is to be perceived enters into the desire to see it, the pattern, the sort of almost built-in instinct towards wanting to see pattern and to hold it, such that it could be understood. Again, this verse is a demonstration of the failure of that holding. It is a failure of the will to accept the responsibility that the mind has to perceive patterns, to perceive them for good, rather than to utilize the contrary, to break apart and to dissolve. For it is not necessarily, I think, our place to dissolve or to destroy. We are here to witness, and to see and to bring together within our capacity, within our species, within each other, and our connectedness to one another. The soul of the wicked desires evil. His neighbor finds no favor in his eyes. So here's another verse where we have a prompting to consider two ends. In the middle there is this gray zone, or darkened zone, this yet to be intelligible, or intuited, or understood path. But the thing is, we have a starting point and an ending point, at least in the beginning of this verse. This sort of thing that we have seen before, this pattern of prompting, and it's quite fascinating. I was thinking about this earlier today, how I think one has to wonder how, if we are to put something into the world, it could be something as simple as a sentence, or as simple as a gesture, or a look, a gaze, how this can sort of manifest downstream. Now, much of this, I think, is beneath the perception of man. I think one has to wonder also that if many of our behaviors and actions, well, maybe I should rewind a little bit, and I think it's a little bit more complicated than just beneath the perception of man. Perhaps this can be perceived, but there's a level of understanding that may not occur, such that the whole thing is connected, that the continuity between point A and point B is not established. And yet the very fact that point A and point B exist means that there is this causal relationship that is taking place independent of our conglomerate, the conglomeration that is the self, from understanding the through line of it all. And there's a degree of independence of this behavior as it is put onto the world, and the complexities of society and of human interaction. I think particularly of the work environment, how tight the boundaries are. It's almost like a guitar string. When it is plucked, it resonates. And we may rub up against these strings, and regardless of our intention, those strings will vibrate. They are quite sensitive to any sort of mechanical stimulus. And because of that sensitivity to the mechanical stimulus, And let's say that this guitar, once the strings have been stimulated, is just, they have to wring themselves out. I think there's more sophistication that we can add there, but just for the sake of this thought, let's say it continues to go. As this string continues to vibrate, it continues to resonate and have effects and move out into the space and enter into the minds of others, and it can grow, it can manifest, it could change and morph. And sometimes I think that in the beginning, our actions, our behaviors, even our perceptions, we may not understand a level deep enough to again see that trail through the woods that leads from from one end to the other. Now there's still a lot of holes that need to be filled in there, which I think this verse will do. So again, the soul of the wicked desires evil. This is where we're going to start. The soul of the wicked desires evil. Now the other verse in this chapter so far that I have in mind here, well, I think there are many, if not all of them, are sort of like this, but the previous one certainly is one like that. There's a stretch in the continuity. There's that bit of irony, the man in the corner on the roof that's separated from his wife that is within a gigantic household. Why are they separated? How can this come to be? By what action does this, by what mechanism is this allowed to be and to exist? And again, I think I had established this relationship that even within this bickering among the couple, there may not be a explicit design on behalf of one party or another to cause this separation. It may just be this constant inclination to a particular behavior that does this. In a family, I think this often is. It's the unfortunate tragedy of being. That is, if it is unaccompanied by this type of mind that is very top-down and constantly questioning and rationalizing. Of course, there's dangers with extremes of both, but again, the point here is the A and B, and the lack of the in-between. And it allows us to trace that in-between. It's much like the illustration that I've been using with the mountain. That is, the base of the mountain is quite large. It is large enough for many people to start at varying aspects of that circumference and not understand or even know where somebody else is starting from. And yet their goal is to all ascend that mountain. That ascent gives them understanding. It increases the light of the mind. Some people will get lost in their way and they find themselves on plateaus and forests on the mountain. And there's all sorts of interesting twists and turns that life can lead us down. But ultimately there is that peak, that divine peak, the intelligible sphere of reality that allows this experience to be. It is there for man to see. The soul of the wicked desires evil. So let's just establish a few things. So given all of that I've said, let's bring this verse into that thought. So in this verse, the A and B are not as far apart as some other verses, because wicked and evil seem to be somewhat related. Or at least it's readily perceivable that they might be related. What's not entirely clear is what it even means to for the soul to be wicked, or the soul of the wicked. Perhaps it's false to say that the soul can be wicked, but rather we are saying of somebody that is wicked, their soul. And then this desiring. So we have to get into the soul, we have to get into the wicked, and then we have to get into this desire. How one could possibly desire something that is evil, and what that means. Again, I refer back to verse 6. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. Now in this verse, the A and B seem much farther apart. That is to say that it's not entirely clear how a lying tongue can be this as extreme as somebody that seeks death. Now there's subtlety in there. There are ways in which a lie can be committed and the person can be walking down that path and then quickly jump off of it and try for some form of redemption. There's a lot of strangeness within that realm, but in the totalizing sense, if one is to follow that path all the way down to the end without jumping off of it, they will find death. That's quite a bit farther, and I've discussed that at length in the last episode. Here in verse 10, the soul of the wicked desires evil. We are not that far apart. So, let's get into the soul of the wicked. Now, we are saying soul of the wicked. In this case, we are considering the tension is being drawn towards the wicked. Wicked is the principal term right here. Not that the soul is an insignificant thing, but rather the emphasis is on the wicked. And because the emphasis is on the wicked, we consider the soul in a secondary sense. The soul of the wicked. Like there is a piece of pie. It is part of the whole. Not that, again, that wicked is the ultimate unity, but is the unity of this verse that is drawing attention to that term, wicked. I think it's an important distinction to make. So we have this whole that is considered wicked. If we examine the soul that finds itself a part of the wicked, which is, I think, an interesting conception, almost like a car that pulls into a gas station. The car is almost like, or perhaps the driver, the vehicle, whatever, is like the soul. The gas station itself is that wickedness. And as the car drives into it, they draw from the well of that wickedness. Now, I'm not making any claim or statement about oil being evil. I'm just saying that within this real-world example, I think this illustration is kind of helpful. So, regardless of whether one thinks that oil is an evil thing or not, it doesn't matter. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that what they are drawing from the pump, let's say it's not oil, it's just pure wickedness, and pure wickedness is fueling the engine of their car. We could probably see that this is not a good thing. But anyway, so we have this station, this wicked station, for which the vehicle of the soul is drawing its nutrition. Its nutrition is the wickedness that drives the soul. And we can imagine that a vehicle can be changed in all sorts of ways. It's a difficult thing to change a vehicle that runs on gasoline to a vehicle that is electric. But there are many components that can be saved. You don't need you don't need to scrap everything about a vehicle. There would have to be a mass reorganization of parts, surely, in order for a car to be switched from electric to gasoline, or from, let's say, sort of your standard gasoline to diesel. Different systems are required to operate this, to use this fuel. Another example, I think we can use money. There are many different ways that we can house that value, that exchange. There are many different materials that we can use to hold it. And it does matter, actually, what material that we use long term to hold that value, although it may be a temporary store of it. The soul of the wicked desires evil. Now, so far in my mind, in my conception, my interpretation, for what I've been able to gather about the term wicked, is that it has been a term that has been used often, surely, within these chapters. But it is a term that I have come to understand that is associated with, or it implies, a profound selfishness. I have been using the term auto-actualization, for which a person considers themselves, it's almost like worshiping the self. I think this is almost approaching the evil territory, but the wicked are those that are so self-absorbed that they find it difficult to see without the self, that the self is the ultimate driver of reality. And although they are not wrong, that I think the mind of the self plays an important role, it is not the thing that is all of experience. It is not the divinity. Perhaps it shares within the divine, but it is not the divine. It is like saying that the soul is wicked rather than the soul of the wicked, which is a subtle distinction. Again, the analogy to the cars, for which the soul can be saved. There's a certain aspect of the car that can be saved, even though it may require fundamental transformation in order for it to be changed from a wicked engine to a good engine. Now, I think it's important here for the moment to reflect that what we see here is the wicked desiring evil. So it's not necessarily the same thing. But I suppose that the wicked could be evil and also desire evil. Like somebody that is hungry desires food. But we have yet to get to that point. Again, I want to continue this reflection on the wicked. That this wicked, this self-absorbed person, I think, and I use often the example of the city walls, that a person, or of a cellular wall, a person that is wicked is a person that wishes for the gates of the city to be closed, or the channel proteins on the cell membrane to remain shut, such that they can only rely on what they perceive to be the nutrients that the self provides, absent of the world without them, or perhaps, or maybe I should say, in addition to that, to the degree to which a person utilizes the outside world is to facilitate the selfish desire of the self. Now, that's not quite all the way to the end. This verse helps us, I think, because if we say the wicked desires evil, and I said that the self utilizes only that which is outside of it such that it can benefit the self, so it desires something about the self. It desires something within itself. It desires an aspect of itself. It desires an independence for which it cannot detach itself from what it is truly bound to. This is sort of your conservative and liberal principle on the cosmological extreme. It is that wicked person is desiring to be absolutely fallen away from the source. Rather than be connected to the source, they think erroneously that they can cut the wire that gives them that impulse, like the electrons that flowed through a wire to give light to a light bulb. The human being, the wicked human being, desires that he may retain the light of the light bulb and yet diminish or completely cut off the flow of electrons from some power supply to it. And to have this, this sort of self-perpetuating, I think about the physics example of the perpetual motion machine, for which people desired to achieve, but certainly it is impossible given the principles that we understand about the physical world. And this is similar. It's the perpetual motion machine of the self, except these individuals do not understand or do not choose to believe that it is not possible to violate these principles and still maintain the self. Now again, these principles are worth talking about. So what exactly does it mean to violate this principle? Just as one violates one may wish to violate and to have light all the time and not pay their electricity bill, which would one of the ways to do that, which would be just to not be connected to the power plant that provides the electricity source. It seems bizarre and it seems strange, which it is. In that sense, we understand that the electricity has to come from somewhere. It has to be channeled in such a way from some source to through a sophisticated network that we have built for ourselves and moderate and control. We ourselves don't necessarily control energy. We direct it so that we can utilize it for our own ends and purposes. In a like manner, I sort of view the soul to be this kind of like this medium. But again, I don't want to get too sidetracked. For we are within the concept of the wicked. We are trying to determine what exactly it means to violate the principle that allows the human being's mode of existence to be. And it's an interesting part of life and level of sophistication such that a mind can come from these quite basic elements and produce something that is autonomous, independent at a certain level, and it can imagine that because it has achieved a certain level of agency and independence, that it desires to take its independence for itself and create something. Create what? Well, it's the repetition of that experience for which he was created and born. It's that which he desires that. Now I think it's easy to get lost here because there's a lot of fanciful thought that goes into this concept. But again, going back to verse 6, the getting of treasures by a lying tongue is the vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. How exactly is this desire, or how exactly is it that a person that loves the experience of the self so much that they wish to preserve it for themselves, how is this evil? How does this get to evil? And surely it is also, I think, important and interesting to reflect on the the aspect or the quality of evil that presents itself under the guise of that which is good. In the C.S. Lewis sense, it is evil is but a misplaced good. And in this sense, evil, as I've found it to be, is the true antagonism of all things. It is, just as in verse 6, to them that seek death. Now, to the evil, they seek it, but again, it is under some delusion and some deception that their experience in life can be something that is independent. It can be a perpetual motion machine. That their conscious mind can continue forever within the state and the form that it is, rather than being part of something that is more than just them. Now, today is a new day, so I apologize, but it may take some time for my mind to get back up to speed here. What I would like to say is that from what I had just expressed there, I think that this is grade 1, let's say, of evil out of potentially 3 grades, like in a ligamentous injury, for example. At the higher grades, I think we have this degree of explicitness or willful intent on the part of the evil person, that they understand the landscape that is before them, and yet they still choose to do that which is contrary, which is a strange sort of thing. It's like the Joker in Batman. It's that willful tension that is placed on good. It's difficult to understand. And this is sort of why I brought up C.S. Lewis and the misplaced good analogy, because if one truly does not feel or does not experience this sense of goodness in what they are doing, even if it is just to tempt and to destroy the established orthodoxy or good for some other conception of it, there seems to be a point at which true evil would be that which is self-absorbing, and the self-absorbing would lead to this atrophy, decay, and necrosis. The soul of the wicked desires evil. His neighbor finds no favor in his eyes. Now, what does this mean? His neighbor finds no favor in his eyes. So I want to begin by focusing on finding favor in one's eyes and what potentially that might mean. So let's start with the end of that. What does it mean to find something within one's eyes? Of course, I'm going to start here with the low-hanging fruit. It is not as though we are physically peering into somebody's eyes and then we see something. And it is upon our sight that we recognize that there is something within the eye that will tell us why there is no favor. Now, in a sense, this is not true. It is true in the sense that physically there would be nothing there, but also there's a sense in which physically there will be something there. Physically there will be nothing floating there, perhaps nothing external or foreign, but there may be a suggestion, perhaps in the dilation of the pupil, the expression of the muscles around the face that orient the eyes, or that orients our attention to their eyes. There's nothing like a particular gaze or look that can tell us quite a lot about somebody's intentions or what they're thinking, or at least in the general direction of their thought. And in that sense, I think we can find some meaning But considering that the eye is not just restricted to the physical structure, that it is also, the eye is an extension of mind, symbolically speaking, because the eye, as a physical thing, is not the only thing that can see. The mind is the thing that ultimately interprets the inputs that are from the organ of the eye, and interprets the various inputs from around the body and the various sensors that give it some understanding of the world that it finds itself in. And as I've talked about many times before, all of this is related to the formation of some identifiable self at the top of that individual pyramid, that autologos, perhaps we can say. And I think ultimately, whether it be from our analysis of one's facial expression or the understanding of one's true thoughts, they're both the reflection of just that, the true thought, the opinion, what the mind of the self sees. And since we are considering favor here, favor is a word that has a few different definitions. It can mean approval, support, liking for someone or something. It could be a gift, a favor. Of course, this is the word that we're defining. A gift. It could be overgenerous, preferential treatment. It could be an act of kindness. But one has to wonder exactly what this is, this favor. And let's say there is, at the fundament, we have a liking, a preference. What causes this liking or this preference to be? Of liking, the definition, a feeling of regard or fondness. It's as though our experience, our heart, is a filter through which our experiences and our perception and even our reason are much like a water treatment plant, are refined, are directed towards some certain outcome. And since in the context of the first part of this verse, the soul of the wicked desires evil, that desiring evil, I think, is the thing that is disruptive of this individual finding favor in the neighbor not finding favor in the eyes of that wicked person. It is because of their desire. Their desire is not outward. It cannot find the person that is external to them. To the degree that their eyes find the person that is external to them at all, it is for their own self-interest. It is only for their gain. Now the word neighbor here is, I think, prompting us to consider the connectedness of this scenario. That what we see here is a person that is self-absorbed, that they're running on the fuel of this wickedness, that they desire this evil, to do the contrary, the desire to push, they want to push themselves towards the center, but they also want to be the center. They wish for instability and destruction, and yet they want to be at the center of that instability and that destruction. Again, it's the Joker in Batman. The neighbor is, now if I think about a neighbor in the context of my own life here, across the hallway, I live in a condo building, across from the hallway, there is a neighbor. And it's sometimes, I reflect on this, that I live in a building with many different units, and it is sort of like a large house, separated by layers of concrete, no doubt, and and different floors, but this is one building, and we all live in the same building. And yet we are all different. There are different families that live here. I know some of the people that live here. I ran into a guy the other day that asked me the question if I had just moved in here, and I explained to him that I had moved in. I had been living here since the day this building was opened to the public, essentially, and he had almost, I think, to the same. Now, I had seen him before, but I don't think that he had seen me before, and because of that, he was very surprised. He was surprised, and he had said to me that it's strange how you could live so long in one place, and share the same building, and not see them. Now, of course, this is not something that was willful or explicit. This was accidental. It's not as though that I had chosen not to interact with him, but although I had seen him, and it's not as though this person had chosen not to see me, although there may have been times that he did. He must have forgotten. It's no big deal. There was no malice there. There was no wickedness, and there was no desiring evil. The result, though, I think, is this general disconnect between those that live relatively close to one another. And I think there is more than just that. It is more than just, this is how it represents, perhaps, in human society. We consider people that live close to one another neighbors. But this is more of a problem within the intelligible sphere. It is a problem of interrelatedness of those beings of experience that have that expression of logos, that centralized capacity for reason, and that filter of desire and feelings to the heart. But I suppose relatedness has always been the issue, hasn't it? All those years that have passed that man has worshipped nature to find himself connected to something that is without himself. Evolving slowly to be able to appreciate that logos within, to organize himself with others, to eventually come to some understanding of a broader conception of the intelligible sphere and the bodies that manifest off of his experience, the flow of a city, of a society, of the ancient gods of old. We could think of the virtues, we could think of the vices, we could think of all of these forces and the sway that they, and the spell that they can put us under. And then we have come to some conclusion of a logos beyond that level of immediacy. Perhaps we understood that the forces of the gods of old, the polytheism of old, were beyond us. Surely we understood and considered those gods to be a part of us as well. But when we evolved to the place of understanding of the divine logos, of a unified logos, and man's participation in that logos, I think we came to a greater understanding of what our behavior ought to be relative to one another. And what I see here, the soul of the wicked desires evil, his neighbor finds no favor in his eyes. This can be an unbeliever. This can be somebody who is exposed to the material and yet chooses otherwise. But much like many of these proverbs, I think it is difficult to draw the line of how these types of people affect our society. Of course, the entirely insular can survive within a society, but they are not beneficial to a society. I think they create excess space between the nodes of intelligibility. Again, since we believe in a unification of this experience, and it is not just some black hole that has popped out of nowhere that is our experience, that the world is sort of sucked into it, but rather it is we who have evolved from the experiential and the intelligible, and we are now experiencing similar to the very thing that had set beingness into motion. And it's rather bizarre for those beings to reject beingness. And it's no wonder why those who reject being are unable to find favor for others in their eyes. When the scorner is punished, the simple is made wise, and when the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. So this is a familiar verse. This is a verse that was introduced, I think, relatively early on in the Proverbs, and I'm thankful to see it this far out into the later chapters here of this book. The scorner is a repeating pattern in the Proverbs, a repeating idea, a repeating expression of behavior. And so I think it's useful to go back into what the scorner is and what the scorner encompasses. So let's imagine our etymological chain here. From Proto-Germanic beginnings, scorn can be traced back to the word skarnjan, Skarnjan. Two possible meanings are associated with this word: shearing and filth. Now, from shearing, we have this sense of cutting away or dismissing, separation. Of filth, we think of disgust, disdain. Now, as we continue into the Old French, the word evolves. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the word that it evolves into, but the meaning of this word is to mock or to deride, to ridicule. In Middle English, we have the word scornen and schornen, which encompassed not only mockery but also general feelings of contempt, disdain, and disapproval. And I see here some familiarity to that disgust. In the modern context, scorn, as it is known to us today, means a forceful rejection, often laced with this anger or disgust. A simple Google search of the definition of the word scorn is the feeling or belief that someone or something is worthless or despicable, contempt. Another interesting definition, as a part of its verb form, refuse to do something because one is too proud. So we have this interesting map of this word. And I like the formation, or at least the initial components of a word in the etymological chain, because I think often that this gives us the building blocks that are necessary to understand further iterations of the word. Now, in terms of that Proto-Germanic, we have that separation, the shearing, and then the disgust. I think we can think of a separation because of disgust. And of disgust, I think there are many potential causes for this. Just to pick some low-hanging fruit here, there was, in my reading of that etymological chain, there was mention of the word dung in terms of what is to be discussed by. And it's an interesting example because we are repulsed in that situation by dung because of its appearance and because of its smell. And if we understand where it had come from, we are also equally disgust, because this is inherently an unclean place. This is the place where what is filtered from the body is excreted. It is something that the body doesn't need. All the useful material has been used by the body, and now what is left over is something that can no longer be consumed. It is the waste. And in a sense, within that, there is this cutting. There is a separation between the useful and the unuseful. And in that separation, our experience or our relationship to that changes, because in the initial form, surely there are bits of that material that are unuseful to us. Perhaps they are connected to the things that are useful. And then through a series of complex biological mechanisms, through metabolism and digestion, we separate these things. And it is not until the center is purified and the marginality, the unfortunate, or rather the unuseful marginality within, is appropriately pushed to the periphery and excreted and separated as dung, as filth. And then we say, okay, it's easier for us to recognize, because we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can't not consume food just because there are elements for which we will excrete later. There's no sense in that. We need the food to survive, to maintain our existence. And so there is a certain level of sacrifice that is there. Now, the interesting thing here, again, is this separation, the peripheralization of the unuseful and the retention of the useful. The question is, where does a scorner, how is the scorner represented within this analogy, within this description? Well, I think at this point it's not necessarily the scorner. It's more an analysis on how the scorner can come to be, how there is this indication or distinction between, or I could say judgment between something that is useful and then something that is unuseful. And of these two things, of the unuseful, the scorner has this tendency to feel disgust, to feel contempt, to think that there is absolutely no value in the thing that is beneath, or again, that is separated to the margin or to the periphery. Now, just like the discussion about the center and the margin, that there is both good and bad within the center, that there is, in a sense, this is how I choose to view it, there are marginal components within the center. That is to say that within the center, within the load-bearing principles that people orient themselves around, there are elements, undoubtedly, just by virtue or by nature of the limitation of human experience or of understanding, such that negative components are an aspect of our lives. We don't know the answers to every single problem. We may have answers to problems that are quite sophisticated, but they may not be complete. And as such, we may miss things. Our behavior is not completely righteous, and that which ought to be moved towards the center and away from those load-bearing principles may remain within. And I think, as I have described before, this is much like a oceanic vent in which there is this bubbling up of material, this molten material, into the flooring of the ocean. And for all of our consideration here, this analogy is meant to describe the continual nature of the production of the marginal within. And it is not as though we will get to this point of complete harmony, at least in the foreseeable future. Perhaps I can't make such a definitive statement, but at least in the foreseeable future, that there's going to be this harmony between the center and the periphery, much like I can make a definitive statement about when the volcanic vents will stop producing this molten material. Much of this, I think, depends on the context and the experience that we are having. The context, I think, often comes to us under the constraints and the affordances of culture, that of the experience that people have at particular ages are influenced by, again, their culture, but also by their technology, by their language, by their organization of their societies, what they value, again, which would be wound up into culture. And then at the periphery, there is both the good and bad element of the good. We can imagine a righteous liberation against a tyrannical center. That spirit, that moving towards the margin, I think of the Jewish experience as in the Exodus from Egypt. There are plenty of negative elements that come with that self-marginalization, but also sometimes it's necessary to do it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that when it's done or when one finds themselves at the margin that it's necessarily bad. Within my own life, I have found marginalization because I needed to move away from a corrupt center and reestablish, reorient, so I could find a more stable center. I think the center is necessary in its good form to be secure and stable. The margin in the periphery is inherently unstable. It is that tossed to and fro on that sea, that analogy in verse 6. And also at the margin there is the bad marginality, the bad peripheralization, which is the place that it ought to be. It is the murder and corruption, the destitution that exists away from the principles of stability at the center. This is a healthy separation from that evil or corruption of mind, corruption of spirit, corruption of body that plagues all of us in life. The more that this is away from the center and towards the periphery, the healthier we are, not only individually but also collectively. We can imagine a situation in which the rule of law is established firmly, such that that which we marginalize is appropriate, such that the rapists and the murderers are kept within the margins of society. They are not at the city center, for which they can corrupt the going-ons and break the binding that keeps culture moving and society stable. Another analogy I think of the disease muscular dystrophy, in which there's a disruption in one of the stabilizing protein structures, such that the contracting of muscle is inefficient and unstable, and it doesn't transmit forces as it necessarily should to produce movement. and control of limbs and regular bodily movement is corrupted in that situation, and in certain situations of the muscles that are responsible for assisting our breathing are corrupted, and that can cause the ending of life. The more that these corruptive forces in the structure of our principles and of our physical structure, the more that this can be pushed towards the periphery, the better we will be. Okay, so we have that understanding of the positive and negative, both with the center and the margin. The scorner, I think, can occupy, much like this positive and negative, the positive and negative component of expressing scorn. Certainly, within this definition here, the feeling or belief that someone or something is worthless or despicable, I can imagine a situation in which something is relatively worthless, like in the case of the dung that excreted filtrate for which there is no nutrition left in it. So that feeling of contempt is not all that negative. There is some justification for it. Now, of despicable, there is this deserving of hatred and contempt. Of contempt, the feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration. Again, this is very harsh language, but there are, I think, aspects, much like the margin, that things are to be considered beneath, that actually deserve this scorning attitude. But by the same token, the negative aspects, much like the margin, the negative aspects of the margin are primarily what the mind goes towards and is most concerned with, because what we want is a stable center, and what we want is the negative elements to be placed where they ought to be. Of the good ways that we can scorn something, or of the good ways that we can marginalize ourselves, these are extraordinary circumstances. These are circumstances that we would not necessarily wish for ourselves, but have to necessarily undertake in extreme situations. And so, in that vein, when I consider the scorner, what I'm considering here is mostly the negative elements of this being. When the scorner is punished. Now, the reason that I went into that illustration is because of the word punished, because this refers to the negative element of the scorner. It is saying that the scorner has gone beyond that which they should consider as worthless or beneath, and what they have attributed that worthlessness to actually is valuable in some way, in a way that they cannot perceive or understand. And the scorner can often be viewed, I think, in terms of this center and periphery analogy, at the center as people that are wise. And of a particular example here, I think of Richard Dawkins. I think there are plenty of things that he says are wise, but within his scorn, within his contempt, he does something to the achievements that he has that he has been afforded within his life, within his academic career, and the advancements of human understanding and biology that he has graced us with. I think that for all of that, there is this negative element of the scorner within him, for which it is very likely that we may come to a time that we see this type of behavior as negative and worth punishment. Now, not all punishments are the same, obviously, and I don't mean punishment in the sense of in judicial terms. I mean punishment more in terms of a cultural, social, perhaps philosophical or theological correction. And by extension, when the scorner is punished, the simple is made wise. Relative to Richard Dawkins, certainly I am a simple person, but we can also imagine a person that is simple in terms that they They don't have an academic background. They aren't particularly well educated, but if they believe in something, if they understand this principle of the positive and negative scorn, the positive and negative marginality at the center and the periphery, I think they are much ahead of Richard Dawkins in this domain. And by virtue of that, this person, without that culturally dignified academic standing, become wise relative to that person, to this Richard Dawkins, to this scorner. Now, this is just one example, one analogy about how this can play out, but there are plenty of different situations in which this can play out. Now, going off of that, I wanted to discuss a little bit about what it means to be simple. I think there's more to be said about the scorner, but I'd like to leave it where it is. I think it's what we've discussed so far is sufficient. And I think there's also an interesting discussion to be had about what is considered wise. Although I think, in the sense that we can differentiate between the scorner and the simple, we will have some broader understanding of what the wise might look like. So in the example of the scorner, the failure is to attribute value where it ought to be. In the sense of the scorner, and in the sense of our earlier analogy between the separation of the useful elements in the food and the filtered, wasteful components, in the negative sense, the scorner is the one that misunderstands the worth of that which is separated from the true excrement. Of the scorner in the negative sense, it could also be a person that is that analyzes the whole of something and only focuses on the negative elements, such that they are unable to appreciate the positive. I think of genocide as one of these experiences in which the group that is responsible for the genocide is unable to determine or to see the positive elements or the humanity in the group that they are persecuting. I think in the Israel-Palestine conflict there is some of this, not necessarily to say that there's a genocide occurring. This is a tricky subject. Almost this sort of thing remains to be seen. Almost after the event we could determine if it is that way or not. But I have, in terms of my alignment, I understand aspects of both sides, but the point is, in this situation, I think that there is plenty of scorn on both sides. There's plenty of positive and negatives associated with that. They have failed to come to some conclusion for which the highest principle is the equality and the value of a man's life. His beliefs have become weaponized. His religion, his very conception of what ought to be revered and what ought to constitute the binding of men to other men have become violent and unstable, at least between these populations. And this is something that causes conflict. And I think within this analogy, the scorner is that which is unable to see because of their view of worthlessness and the opinion that the other is despicable because of their beliefs or because of who they are or whatever. I think as this approaches the killing of another person, it becomes, I want to say superficial, but perhaps it's not superficial. It is it becomes more centralized in this center-periphery analogy. And as it becomes more concentrated and more solidified, what we have is the risk, and certainly the sacrifices that are conducted. That is, that once one center is established, a sacrifice is required. And the sacrifice that is required is often quite lofty, depending on the principle at the center that one wishes to establish. We could think of any number of mechanical analogies that if we want freedom, we will have to sacrifice stability. If we want stability, we'll have to sacrifice freedom. This can be mechanical just as much as it can be political. In the shoulder joint, for example, it has 3 degrees of freedom, meaning that it can move in 3 planes of motion: the transverse, the frontal, and the sagittal. And because of its relatively high degrees of freedom relative to a more stable joint like the joint in the knee joint, the tibiofemoral joint, the shoulder is it's unstable. Or rather, it requires more sophisticated involvement of the musculature surrounding the joint via the rotator cuff and the other supporting muscles, such that it can move within those degrees of freedom, but also maintain a relatively stable joint. And this pattern, I think, is consistent as much as it is in the physical domain as it is in the spiritual or the heavenly. Now, there is a rather interesting implication here, that the scorner is somebody who is of greater complexity than that of the simple. And I think part of the reason for that is the scorner is involved in making quite complicated decisions. Now, surely for one to have scorn, it could be a fairly superficial, but at the same time, it is an opinion. It is, again, this feeling or belief that something or someone is worthless or despicable, contempt. There is, even if it's beneath the surface, an understanding of what is worthwhile and what is worthless. The simple may not even get to that point, or they may. Of contempt, again, the feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, worthless. Of something that is worthless having no real value or use. And if we are to go down in this road, it's possible that the scorner could be quite imaginative or thoughtful in their understanding for which they describe or ascribe value and worth to certain things. This could also be quite superficial. We have to wonder about... We have to stay somewhat consistent, I think, with this verse. I think there is an implication that the scorner in this situation is not simple. But it's hard to say because, surely we can imagine a situation in which somebody is a scorner and also is quite simple. I think of Forrest Gump, not that he's a scorner, but he is sort of a wise person, and he's also simple. He is oriented well, such that his simplicity is not a hindrance on his behavior, on his action, or his participation with the world. And in some cases, in many cases, his simplicity and his lack of sifting through the details is the very thing that saves him from that scorner's prison, for which he is continually battling the value hierarchy and getting lost in the minutia. And in this sense, he is considered wise because of his capacity to connect people, to bind people together. In the movie, he saved Lieutenant Dan from suicide and alcohol. He produced companies that employed people. He was a faithful person to his mother and to God. He kept a faithful relationship to to the woman that he loved, even though that she was an unstable character. He was this person for her that was a stable center. He did not scorn her because of her negative elements, which seemed to predominate her life, which seemed to be the marginal destroying her center. She was heavily involved in drugs. She was taken advantage of physically. She was interacting with life in all of the ways that were similar to her upbringing, that she was molested by her father, and her father was an alcoholic. And because of that stability that he offered her, she eventually, by her interaction with him, even though she would come and then she would leave, she would come and then she would leave, that interaction, I think, every time had, much like the process of digestion or any general filter, had filtered out some of the negative aspect, had introduced some positive love into her life, and she began to heal slowly. And eventually, at the end, there was this reconciliation and they got married. In the case of Jenny, she was a self-scorner. She thought herself to be worthless. She didn't think many things were worthwhile or valuable, besides Forrest Gump. And she understood that, I think, and she tried to separate herself from him. And she also scorned Forrest to a degree because he was simple, and she said that he didn't understand what it meant to love somebody. And to his response was, I may not be a smart man, but I know what it means to love somebody. Sort of an interesting reflection, interesting statement, and I think it has exactly, it's exactly right up this alley. When the scorner is punished, the simple is made wise, and when the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. This is the second half of this verse is another thing that we see often in the Proverbs. When the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. As if the scorner was instructed, the scorner would not receive knowledge. And so I think it's worth here talking a little bit about what causes this to be, what causes the gates to be opened for the wise to accept instruction such that they can gain an understanding or knowledge. And then in the reverse situation of the scorner who has contempt for things, who thinks things beneath, how it is the opposite, the closing of the gates such that nothing can get in and to positively benefit them. Now I think within the question that was posed there, and the explanation of the question, there is the answer. Thus far I've been making the distinction or defining the way in which the scorner, or perhaps we can say the way in which the wicked operate, is that they necessarily close themselves off to the rest of the world. And when they do open those gates, for which there is this necessary relationship between them and another person, the reasons for which they occupy that space, the reasons for which they tie down that relationship, it is but few, it is but internal reasons, it is for their own sake, for their own good. Now, it's not to say that a man that is righteous does not do things for his own good, and surely he does, but it's about how this is related. It's about how one understands what is good for oneself. Again, we get into this C.S. Lewis example of that which is evil, perhaps, can be seen as a misplaced good. It is farther and farther away from that central source of intelligibility. Whether by will or by mistake, it doesn't matter, I think, in the broad sense of it. At least in the observational sense of it. Perhaps it does matter at some level, but we need not get there at the moment. And so to say a little bit more of this, we have a situation in which there is openness. We have a situation in which there is restriction. In and of themselves, both much like the margin and the center, open and restriction can have positives and negatives associated with them. Now, of that which is closed or that which is restricted, of the positive of that aspect, we have that which is discerning and looks forward enough to understand that which is potentially dangerous and thereby restricts movement, action, behavior, relationships on that basis. Self-preservation is an element of it. Now there is an aspect of the opposite in which one understands that self-sacrifice, perhaps, and this self-sacrifice can occur at many different levels, is appropriate. And this self-sacrifice is a degree of openness when most people would close themselves off or restrict themselves. Sometimes they would do so not out of a misplaced good, but rather, who is to say, maybe I'm not able to judge at that level. But the point is that there is a tricky territory when we get into that. But at the base level, or at the surface here, the good and the bad that is associated with restriction, we have the bad, which is too much is restricted, that there's not enough information that enters into the system to influence decisions. And that restriction, again, could be because of one's will or because of some outside influence, such that they are made a slave, for example. But of perhaps the important aspect here, that of the willful restriction, an undiscerning person will find themselves restricted when it serves them, and it serves those that they love, perhaps, or it serves what? It's hard to say. The self and the self's desires, all the way up to the preservation of the life of the self. It's hard to say exactly where appropriate restriction may lie. Now, I think we can imagine certain analogies and examples, like a family, for example, or a house. There are certain people, certain characteristics for which I would look to determine whether or not a person is welcome in my home. And I would not, despite the characteristics of a person, accept anybody without some sort of connection. Now, even if that connection occurs at the door, maybe somebody's in want, there still must be that connection. There must be some observation. The door is not open all of the time. Now, if my door was closed all the time, I would be a miserable mess. I would not go out. People would not come in. I would not have that connectedness to the world and to others that is somewhat necessary, I think, to maintain a degree of sanity. But it's not just sanity, it is a degree of perspective. A perspective that orients one to the way that things are, not necessarily to the way things ought to be. But without that experience, that proper experience, the orientation of the self to things as they ought to be, I think, is much more difficult in practice, even if they have some conception of the way things ought to be. Now, of the scorner, I think we can say that despite there being good and bad elements both attached to the openness and to restriction or closedness, the scorner occupies that space for which that which is open and that which is closed is or serves something inferior. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to serve something? Well, if we imagine our attention, if we orient our attention to something, we are attending to something. We are paying, an interesting expression, paying attention. We are paying not just resources, we are paying time, we are paying experience, we are paying our life to a certain degree towards something. And what we pay attention to matters, for we can pay attention to nothing but useless videos on TikTok or Instagram, whatever, and not get anything out of it. Or perhaps we do get quite a lot out of it, but it is not anything that is substantial. It is not anything that puts us in a position of life, of success, or of deeper connection and connectedness to the world. It is something that dulls our experience. It is something that places our mind in a warehouse, a storage space. It is something that medicates the mind, and it prevents it from that potential of experience, of that explosion of intelligibility that it has the capacity to experience. And so what I'm looking for here is what exactly the scorner is after, what they're paying attention to. If they are constantly considering things that are beneath them, then what is above them? And my answer is the same. It's probably it's nauseating at this point, I think, to continually go over the surface, but perhaps that there is a reason for this, but it goes along with the conception of the wicked, and that is that it is an internalization, an orientation inward, that the self, perhaps the experience of the self is the highest thing, that there is nothing outside of the self that is more worthwhile to pay attention to. And there are many downstream consequences of that. That is self-isolation, ignorance, egocentrism, the perspective of the self that is, it's the perspective of the person that is quite, again, insular. It is something that is difficult, a person that is difficult to connect with and to have experience with. Perhaps it's better put in these words. The scorner is that which looks down. Now that which is at the top is that thing that is looking. Perhaps it could be both the case that the thing at the top, or the thing that the wicked that captures the wicked's attention, is the self, but also it could be that the self is so high, the self is that ineffable thing. Perhaps it occupies a space in the ineffable, but it is not the ineffable. And because of this, because of its belief that it is the thing that is above everything else, its attention is constantly oriented downward. And if it is constantly oriented downward, well, what does that mean? In a physical sense, looking down means to look at a place from a higher surface to a lower surface. That doesn't tell us anything, but symbolically, certainly it does. If a higher surface is a surface of purpose and meaning and of value, and if a lower surface is the opposite of poverty and corruption, then one will see that which is beneath them in that light. And so the question is, how then does this prevent knowledge from being received? I suppose we have to ask ourselves, well, what is knowledge? That's quite the subject. But I think we could say that knowledge is the proper orienting of our accounts, or our attention to proper judgments. Now, proper judgments are things that I think are necessarily bound not just within the self. It involves the self, but it involves an aspect of the world that is and I shouldn't say external. This internal-external business is certainly what we're being prompted to consider here, but I think we're also being prompted to consider what is more than just that relationship between the self and the outside. The dangers of the self, of being insular, is quite obvious. But the inability to receive knowledge, I think, is the inability to exist free of the improper constraints of the ego. That their marginality is constantly challenged and not affirmed as the same with their center, with their core principles. It's constantly challenged and not affirmed. When the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. And for somebody to be instructed and receive knowledge, they must be humble. They must be open to a degree. They must, I think, retain some binding so that they don't just get swept up into the sphere of unintelligible information. You can't receive knowledge in that way. A man can't live his life swept up in a tornado. It just doesn't make any sense. He has to be grounded. He has to be on the earth, and he has to be participating in activities that will sustain him. And so the wise is not somebody who is uselessly open, such that they are swept up and the mind receives and takes in information but can't make sense of it. I think the wise is one that is grounded and bound to something that is constantly affording them something, but they are also affording the part of themselves to that thing. There's that sacrifice and acceptance relationship on both sides, reciprocation. And because of that experience, because of that dynamic experience, they are grounded and stable. They are around the hearth of unification. And they receive knowledge where they are. They receive knowledge as an addition to their experience, not as a subtraction, not as an insult. As a challenge, sure, but not as a challenge against the worth of their soul, but a challenge against the height of their ignorance, which of course the wise would want to continually decrease. The righteous man wisely considers the house of the wicked, but God overthrows the wicked for their wickedness. So who is this righteous man? What is a righteous man? This righteous man is, from a basic Google definition, of a person morally right or justifiable, virtuous, upright, upstanding. It's funny how one can yearn for secrets that are hidden within the words that we use. Undoubtedly, the words that we use are full of meaning. And undoubtedly, as we live our lives, words that we have used for many years come to mean something different. Or, as we experience something, perhaps the experience changes our understanding of how we use the word. I think there are many words for which people use quite loosely until they have undergone some experience or have felt something in a particular way such that the word is now almost shape-shifted and they cannot use that word loosely anymore. There are many examples in my life, but I think of a relatively lighthearted example in the Harry Potter series in which they cannot say the word Voldemort, that name of the person who committed unspeakable acts. And it's interesting, as I think of this sort of thing away from the popular novels in my own life, and I think of words much like Voldemort that I really don't want to say. And there's a rational aspect of my mind that can take the word and I could throw it out 100 times. But that would be to deny an aspect of myself that understands what is meaningful about that word and about the experience that was formed in. Now, I bring all of that up because when I see righteous man, there is this longing within me that wishes to understand what that righteous man is, just by virtue of reading the word or the term. But what comes to me is that there is experience that must be had, there must be life lived, there must be lessons learned, mistakes, and circumstances that have occurred that are outside of one's conception. We can imagine all day long, and perhaps that'll get us somewhere. But there's nothing quite like practical experience that shows us what is right and what is wrong, just by the way of the nature of things. Just as if we were to hurl ourselves off of a high surface, gravity would take over, and regardless of what we would wish, we can wish that we would fly, but in the end, we will be taken by the way that things are. And so I can imagine that this righteous man is an upstanding person, that he has his moral mapping sorted to the world as the world is, but of course I have limited experience. I have experience, but perhaps what I'm coming to understand is what one should desire is experience. They should desire themselves to be in a place of being able to experience, such that they are able to learn, just like in the last verse, when the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. His first instruction is to experience, and as he experiences, as he goes through different things, he receives knowledge, he receives the result of the experience. He receives the evidence to confirm or refute his beliefs. Now, of course, there can be many people that have plenty of experience that are not considered to be righteous. The righteous man wisely considers the house of the wicked. He's not just considering it, he's wisely considering it. Within the word wise, it's impossible to consider that word without bondedness and reverence. There's the religio that is inherently wound up within the wise. And so, under the consideration of the hearth, that thing, that divine logos that binds all, we can form any number of shapes with our mouth to form words like love. But we have to have some word, perhaps we can use love, that encapsulates that expanse of meaning that would be sufficient enough to bind all of man around it. All of man around it such that it is good. The righteous man wisely considers the house of the wicked. So when we say wise, we consider that hearth, we consider the bondedness of man around that hearth, and then we consider the wicked in relationship to that. That, of course, the wicked is bound to it to a certain degree because he's an experiential being. He is able to intuit. He is part of this fractal experience, or fractal structure. But he chooses to be away from that centerpiece. He chooses to have his own centerpiece for his own desires. And so within this understanding that although he may be bonded to that which we wish to be closer to, as the righteous man ought to be, he wishes to warm his hands closer to the fire rather than be in the depths of some freezing lake, for example. And it would seem in this verse that is all that this wise person can do. For what does it mean to overthrow the wicked? Surely he can overthrow him in a sense, but there's another sense in which the wicked is a principle. It is a way of being. In order for a way of being to be overthrown, it's not just an individual that is overthrown, it is the entire pattern of experience that is overthrown. And they are overthrown for their wickedness, for their insular nature, for their selfishness, for their selfish desire. Whoso stops his ears at the cry of the poor, he also shall cry himself, but shall not be heard. Now my mind immediately goes to guilt. Now why does it go to guilt after such a verse? Well, because I've had the experience, I'm sure we've all had the experience of passing somebody on the road in our car that are poor, sort of materially in a bad way. There's all different types of poverty out there. And at this moment, it's not immediately clear to me if it matters what type of poverty we're talking about. I think it's easier for now just to conceptualize the homeless person on the street that is begging for something. Now, I think there are many facets to this. Surely you can have a poor person that is begging, that within their life there are many things that they can do for which their state of poverty and their begging nature could be greatly reduced. I think that's true for many things, but that's not necessarily getting at the point. The state of poverty, I think, extends in some sense. There's a degree of self or learned helplessness there, but there's also a reality of frustration. There's a reality of impotence. There's a reality of restriction. There's a reality of seemingly insurmountable barriers. And although it may be within a person's grasp and ability to move themselves outside of the state that they are in, in many cases, it is beyond them to see how that is even possible. And in my own life and my own moments of poverty of mind as it has turned out to be, I lack the self-confidence to do as I ought to do, although I think at some level understand that it is my own doing that keeps me behind, that keeps me delayed. Whoso stops his ears at the cry of the poor. Now we have to think for a moment at the cry of the poor. We can imagine a straightforward example or analogy for which somebody comes up to the car and asks us for something. That begging for money it's a type of cry. It is an ask for a way to maintain oneself. All of the things that I mentioned still stand there, but there's something much deeper in this verse that I think it's trying to get at. What does it mean to stop one's ears? It is not to hear the cry. It is not to hear the complaint. It is not to listen or pay attention. Perhaps because we don't want to be frustrated at one's incompetence. Perhaps we don't want to think of ourselves as possibly finding ourselves in that situation. Perhaps. There's a lot of perhapses out there. But the point is, the stopping of one's ears is the cessation of the organ that allows us to take in information. Now, what we have discussed before, again, about the openness and closedness or restriction, and then of verse 11, when the wise is instructed, he receives knowledge. Instruction can come in many ways. The instructor does not have to be at the front of the classroom. The instructor could be an animal. The instructor can be a particular event or sign. It could be the impoverished person, or it could certainly be a teacher, whatever. The point is, information is information. The righteous man wisely considers the house of the wicked. That's a type of pattern. We can just as easily say the righteous man wisely considers the plight of the poor, because it's not a simple matter just to accept elements, to accept or to say and to accept the marginality, full stop. There are many negative aspects of marginality. It is not the whole of something that we accept. We accept certain aspects so that we can bring it towards something that is redeemable, towards a redeemable whole, because the current whole that exists is an antagonism. It is not a true unity. It is a pseudo-unity that causes its place in the world to be in its state of poverty. Whoso stoppeth his ears at the cry of the poor, he also shall cry himself, but shall not be heard. Now this is a tough one. It's a tough one partially because I don't think I've explained sufficiently to myself exactly how it is that within my own life I ought to approach the poor, certainly when confronted. I don't think the answer is as simple as giving a person money when they ask for it. And the answer also, I think, is not to hear them. And then one must ask, well, what is the appropriate action in such a situation? That problem, that court for which we find ourselves desperately trying to find justice, seems to fall on deaf ears. The judge Perhaps he's paying attention, but I can't hear what the sentence is. I can't hear what the verdict is. Perhaps that's the point. It is the decision. It is the decision between I want to say something fanciful, like listening to the judge, for example, or listening for an answer. Just listening in general, just like I've talked about before, it is experience, it is just doing. But doing what? Give him money, what does it mean down the road? If I give him money, does it mean a sandwich? Does it mean heroin? If I give him a conversation, does it mean that he is unable to eat because I've distracted him? Does it mean that... have I truly given him something that will allow him to be heard? And what does it mean for him to be allowed to be heard? Within the depths, I think, of my speech, there is that thing for which I know causes my sin, my disbelief, my wickedness, perhaps. And if I had spoken this to somebody, for me to be heard, I think, would be for me to articulate that which plagues me, that which causes me to sin, that which corrupts my being, essentially. It is a form of this reciprocation, that is, this asking of me to say and to speak the truth and to speak honestly. To be heard is to be understood. I suppose that within oneself one can understand and be heard. And this is what I'm uncertain about, if there is something unique about, surely there is, in the proper context, of somebody that hears what I have to say, that truly understands what I struggle with, perhaps hears me better than I hear myself. Now that's quite an ask if somebody is just walking up to my car and asking for money. But perhaps there is a way of a man, of a righteous person, that can cut to the chase, that could say something to somebody or exchange. Again, it can't be one-sided. There must be some sort of exchange. Perhaps it is an exchange of a look or an expression, a statement, a question, an answer, that prompts one down the path of reflection and of understanding of that bondedness. Again, I think of the hearth around which we all rotate, that true axis of meaning and purpose. And of course, it is quite an ask. I think we have to give ourselves some grace that the man at the window may not be saved by what we have to say. We may not save ourselves by our reflection of our hearing of the impoverished man. However, what we can do, I think, is to move towards. I think the quality of the wise is that moving towards that bondedness, that connectedness, for which we can save ourselves and truly bring ourselves up out of misery and that type of poverty. And I think it matters. It matters if we understand how to move ourselves away from that cry. We also understand if we don't understand something, how one ought to cry, in what situation, what ear would be receptive to it, in what situation, what context. And so that if we are a certain way with those who are poor and are in want, or uncertain, or lost, it is of our own experience with just that poverty, and the reflection where in our lives we are poor, where we are lost, where we are subject to that force that causes us to sin, that we come to some common understanding, a bondedness, a reciprocation within that poverty. And in such a reciprocation, surely we both would hear each other. It's a depth of experience, although perhaps not of a similar magnitude, but at a certain level, we can expand it out to that great cosmic image, the Russian doll, the repeating pattern, the fractal structure of reality. If we can find within ourselves that experience, however small it might be, and expand it out with humility, no doubt, to say words that don't give our superficial experience, perhaps relative to the impoverished man living under the bridge, but to say words that he relates to so deeply, that comes from a place that is so deep, that we connect and we are both heard. I think this is part of the essence, at least in my mind, of this verse. Whoso stops his ears at the cry of the poor, he also shall cry himself, but shall not be heard. At least in that situation, it's not possible to miss it. Both parties will be heard. It will be heard honestly. A gift in secret pacifies anger, and a reward in the bosom strong wrath. Okay, so like we usually do, let's start with the first half of the verse, see what we can make of it. A gift in secret pacifies anger. Now, under what situation would I give a gift to somebody in secret? I think there is an implication, given that it is secret, that it is unknown to the receiver. It's either unknown to the receiver or it's unknown to anybody but the receiver and myself. Those are our two potential paths there. Another way, I think, that this gift can be realized, or maybe realize is not the right word, but rather given in secret, is by there being an explicit understanding of a transaction that is this giving. Now, there is no word giving here, so I have to be a little careful not to insert too much into the verse, but if we imagine that a gift is given from one individual to the next, we have this, or just something is given from one individual to the next. We have a transaction, and this transaction may be known at some level, but the gift may be hidden at another level, almost like a Trojan horse in a positive sense, or a negative sense, I suppose, in which, on the surface, the Trojan horse is this model of a horse. It's a wooden horse. But within is the enemy that is camped, and that when they are given that the city thinks that they are receiving a gift that is this horse, they will wheel it in within their gates. They will unlock them, wheel it in, leave it where they may leave it, and then at night these soldiers will spring out and do what they will. Now we can imagine this in a positive sense, in which there may be a type of gift. I don't know the exact situation in which this might occur, but I think of leaving somebody maybe a note that can be a sort of a gift, or in the monetary sense, I think giving something small and then putting it aside to have it grow over time, that's an interesting sort of gift that transcends, that continues to grow after the action has taken place. So that's another possibility. Now I think it's important here to recognize that I can continue this way, in this manner, for some time and keep on putting forth possibilities. I think it's important to recognize that within the possibilities, within the multitude, the faith and the belief is that we can take this multitude once it is known to us and convert it, or to centralize it into something that is higher. That there is some reason or something that unites them, such that we can have a better understanding of the multiplicity. And so I'm going to continue this process, but under the understanding and that faith that at some point there will be a more centralized path to go. A gift in secret pacifies anger. Perhaps we ought to talk a little bit about what a gift is. A gift is something that is perhaps bought and given to somebody else for a special occasion. Perhaps it doesn't have to be a special occasion, but something that is not necessarily within the grasp of the person that is receiving the gift. It is something that is the property or in the control or under the authority of another individual that transfers that relationship to another person. So if we imagine this gift as a transfer of a relationship, then we add this component of secrecy, that it is not something that is known or seen, or not meant to be known or seen by others. And so we have a very intimate environment here, in which this authority is now, or this relationship is now being shifted, reoriented. And anger, much like a crying child, is pacified by this transfer of relationship. It is pacified. And since anger is this intense, strong emotion, again, much like this crying child, it was quite difficult to pacify. Unless we have something like a pacifier. It doesn't have to be necessarily a binky. It could be music. It could be soothing touch. Those are all forms of pacification. But in all cases, I think in the case of the infant, what is introduced is a new relationship. The infant is now related to the music, they are related to the binky, they are now related to that touch. There is a new stimulus that enters into the system. That new stimulus is the pacifying factor. It nullifies that expression. Or it alters the expression, perhaps. And so perhaps we can say that the changing of one's relationship to something, or adding something to somebody else, like a gift, will cause their behavior to change. That's quite a simple way to express it. It could be any sort of extreme behavior. It doesn't have to be anger. It could be sadness, an intense melancholy. And so what exactly is happening here? Has there been some justice served, such that certainly a person that is angry would have some reason to be angry? The infant cries for some reason, perhaps because of gas or because of general irritability, but surely there is some reason, or for want of attention. And I suppose we can ask the question, is it required for us to have a reason such that we feel an emotion? Or perhaps maybe we feel an emotion such that we arrive at a reason? Perhaps both are possible. I believe in my life I experience both, an emotion before the reason and reason before the emotion. And by this logic, it seems as though we have a two-way street, that the causative factor can be from the heart, or the causative factor can be from that rational aspect, reasonable aspect of the mind, that is, and can be somewhat independent of the heart's desire, its will of its own, its sort of primordial will. And because we have this two-way street, it is a reciprocal relationship. Or perhaps maybe we can't say to that extreme that it is reciprocal, although it may be reciprocated. A two-way street certainly affords us a relationship. So if we imagine this two-way street from the reasonable mind to the desirous mind, or the heart, and we place a gift there in secret. Again, a gift is a transfer of relationship. We think of property. I think usually when we think of transferring of a gift, I have a water bottle that is sitting in front of me that is engraved. It's a metal water bottle. It has my name on it and a logo. It's kind of interesting. And this was given to me by a coworker. It was a gift. I did not know that they were going to give it to me. There was a secrecy there in that gift. He had a relationship to that item before I had a relationship to that item. Now he somewhat still has some relationship to the item since he bought it, he paid for it, he thought of the idea. And yet now this bottle is also related to me. It is in my possession. I own it. It is my property. Now this is gift giving at one level, at one layer. The layer that we are in now is the mind dimension, the intelligible sphere, the heavenly domain, perhaps we can say. And when I imagine this gift, it comes from without. We don't even have to necessarily imagine that it is known where it comes from. In fact, I rather prefer to interpret this verse that the secrecy is indicative that this gift that has come from without is unknown, where it came from or who gave the gift. So here we are, this two-way street, and this gift plops down onto it. What we know is that we are angry. We can ask the question, does it matter if the anger was born of the heart or born of reason? Does it matter what side of the street that the car or that information is traveling on? Perhaps not. What we are primarily concerned with is the car itself. The car of the anger. The car of the reason, perhaps we are not too concerned with, because it is not what we are called to here. What we are called to reflect on is the anger. Now, the anger, again, may be an outgrowth of the reason, or the anger may be on its way from the heart to the rational aspect of the mind. Again, I don't think it matters. But what is important, what is worthwhile making the distinction of, is that we are not concerned with the passenger or the traveler, that is, that rational thought. We are interested in the desirous component, the anger, that frustration, in a sense, that antagonism, that sense of wronged or being wronged. Now, all of a sudden on this road, there's an accident. That car that is full of anger, the driver at the wheel, that sense of anger, he must stop, he must pull over. Perhaps his vehicle has been damaged. Or perhaps he was pulled over by a police officer. Who knows what the exact situation is? What we know is that there has been some situation in which the transmission of anger has been stopped. Now we're getting closer and closer to the point of understanding how the anger gets pacified. It has yet to be pacified. All we know that it has been stopped. We can ask the question, does it matter for what reason this anger has been stopped? The directionality of the anger has been stopped. Perhaps the feeling is still there, but the directionality and that sense of being wronged has been put on pause. This is a strange thing. I think I have had this experience of just sort of being a bit irritable for no particular reason. And then when it reaches a certain threshold, I reflect on it. If it is nothing of importance, it fades away. Sometimes there are things that I have to do that I remember, and that causes a sense of irritability to rise before I reflect on that thing that I have to do. And perhaps sometimes it's not as bad as I thought if I had ignored that feeling for a while. The irritability is a sense of anger to a certain degree. It's not all that directed until it is realized in this sense. This is more of the born of the heart example or analogy. As with many words, as we go down to a certain level, I think we find this almost circular pathway through language. That is, we can ask ourselves, well, what does anger mean? It might mean annoyance or displeasure, hostility. And we go into those words and we'll find other words, we'll find definitions of those words, and then ultimately we'll find ourselves back at anger, frustration, vexation. The word that I saw when I was looking through the definitions of anger and then going through that process was opposition. And it was a bit unlike the other words. Opposition seems to be more at the root. I suppose we can say irritability is also at the root. It's sort of a pure emotion, pure sense. It's not really tied to reason in particular. And so the question must be then, why am I choosing to analyze the emotion that is divorced from the reason? And if this anger is something to be considered, that somebody has been wronged by something, then there is some reasonable, rational component to it. And when I say reason or rational, I mean that there is something that is independent of just feeling and existing. I suppose to a degree I feel something now, and I'm not really reflecting on it. Perhaps it's influenced by what my mind is doing and thinking, but also there are probably periods, as I speak now, of minor fluctuations in my emotions. Some of these can be quite significant. Sometimes I find myself thinking that I'm a bit fatigued and I'd like to take a second to yawn, and perhaps I would like to ask myself really quick, well, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Is this worthwhile? Sometimes I get into this spiral. Everybody has their own idiosyncrasies, I suppose. But when I say reason, there is the implication that there is some cause, explanation, or justification. This sort of processing occurs in that aspect or part of the mind that can form these ideas, these complex ideas. It is not an experiential thing. It's tied to the experiential, no doubt, because it is, again, it is related to the heart. Again, in this analogy here, I think we're talking about levels of the brain. It's not necessarily the organ of the heart and the organ of the brain, clearly. But just by matter of experience, this seems to me to be true, and this is certainly something that we're prompted to consider in the Proverbs. There's another definition of reason, that is the power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic. So again, to return to the question, why am I choosing to analyze the emotion that is divorced from this reason? I had mentioned earlier that anger was the driver of the vehicle that we were concerned with. The passenger surely could be reasonable. But let's say that I am the gift that has come in. I have flown in under secrecy, and I have seen something that I am concerned about. This driver is driving erratically. He seems angry. I pull him over, and indeed I find that he is quite angry. But I don't understand why he is angry. His anger is something that is putting other people at risk, potentially. In this landscape that is not necessarily infrastructure, road, legal representative, and citizen, but rather an internal experience of emotion and of judgment, of justification. By my secrecy, I pulled this car over. I walk up to the door. The window is rolled down, and I see anger in front of me. Then I'm faced with a number of options. Now, this person was driving erratically, but he did not necessarily commit a crime. Perhaps the erratical driving was a bit of enough to pull him over and give him a citation or what have you. But there are many police officers out there that approach these situations with grace, with discernment, and it's not necessary that every situation requires a ticket. And since I've been a gift, which is generally seen as a positive thing, and not something that is meant to, by the verse, do anything other than pacify this anger, I understand as I approach this vehicle and I stare at anger in the face that my role here is to pacify this situation. And the question is, how do I go about doing this? Perhaps I'm being too soft in my approach to understanding pacification. But it is tied to this gift after all. And surely pacification can have a positive and a negative component to it. That within the word pacify there is the idea of quelling anger, agitation, or excitement. The definition of quell is to put an end to, typically by the use of force. But again, we have come here under the pretense of a gift, and so we will not use this force. We can still pacify in the sense that we can appease or calm. We can assuage. We can bring peace to. And I suppose here comes my earlier question of why I chose to identify or separate reason from anger. Let's say for a moment that I have anger step out of the car, have him cool off. Perhaps he is being fueled by his reason. Now I have yet to know this to be the case. And so when I have this emotion that is now separated from reason, perhaps I can no longer call it anger. I can call it irritability, I can call it opposition, but perhaps anger, I can no longer call it. And so I put this opposition out of view of reason, and I bring it back to my car, my police car, and I question it. Now, by its nature, it will be in opposition to me. And I find, as I do this, that this opposition is unyielding. It is by its nature that it opposes me. It is irritable by its nature. And no matter what I say to it, I cannot calm it. And so I find myself wanting to talk to the passenger, wanting to talk and speak to that reason. And so I go do that. I go to the driver's side with the opposition standing, or perhaps in the back of my police cruiser, and I'm at the passenger side, and I ask him to roll down the window, and he rolls it down. And now I speak with reason. Now I can ask why. Why are you with opposition? Why are you, reason, with opposition? Why have you created this anger and this destructive behavior on the road, potentially risking safety not only of the occupants of the vehicle but also other people on the road, other emotions, other thoughts that may pass by? Now we must remember that I am a gift that has been sent to pacify. And so I approach the situation carefully, with concern. Perhaps as a father might approach his son with concern about his behavior. Concern because it is out of love, and not out of anger. And so I say, in the spirit of love, what reason do you have to be in this relationship? To opposition. And perhaps he gives me his reason, as reason does. Specifics I don't think matter. And I give him another reason, a better reason, to form a different judgment. Now when he sees that this reason is better, and that the judgment is worth making, what has been done here is an alteration of his relationship, or of his desire to be related. And if it reaches the stage of desire, the relationship has changed, because now the heart has sent a new vehicle down the road, for which this passenger will enter that vehicle and be on his way, for which reason will enter the car of, let's say, not opposition, but of better judgment. That's not an emotion, perhaps, but by his better judgment, he will enter the car of hopefulness, a degree of levity, perhaps. And in so doing, I have opposition left at my car, and perhaps I put him in the back of my cruiser. And since he is not attached to reason, he slowly decays, for he has nothing to sustain him. And I think this is the way in which a gift in secret can pacify anger. That relationship is changed, because the gift itself comes in to change that relationship that the reason has to the emotion, to the heart. The second half of the verse, and a reward in the bosom, strong wrath. Now it seems as though we may have to jump back into our illustrative landscape. A gift in secret pacifies anger. We have seen that story. And now what of a reward in the bosom? Strong wrath. Now in the bosom, I think that we are talking about some equivalent to that of the heart, that of the emotional sphere. In some sense, the experiential sphere. And so much like talking about this gift, I think we have to talk about a reward. What does it mean to be given a reward, or to find the reward placed in the bosom? A reward is something that is given to somebody, perhaps, much like a gift. But a reward is given for some action that is perceived right. I am rewarded for my good grades. I am rewarded for my good behavior. I am rewarded for my hard work. I have done something good, such that I am receiving something. Now today is a new day. That last bit of recording was from yesterday. It is now the night following. And so like usual, it takes me a little bit to get back up to speed of where I was. We are talking about the second half of the verse. Verse 14, a gift in secret pacifies anger, and a reward in the bosom strong wrath. And I had just commented on the situations in which one may be rewarded. And so it might be worth diving into that in a little bit more detail. Much like the first part of the verse in which we had discussed this gift, perhaps we took a road that is atypical in terms of analyzing what a gift can do within our psyche. A reward, I think, can also be seen as a form of a gift. There's a definition that I see here in front of me: make a gift of something to someone in recognition of their services, efforts, or achievements. Now, the Proverbs have an interesting way of showing us a reflection, or an inversion, perhaps I should say. And this inversion is a reflection, of course, in an inverted manner, as one may see the reflection in the water. It seems as though there are two aspects of the person, the one that is above and then the one that is below. But the one that is below, of course, is in this inverted way. Now, the one above, we have this positivity, and the one below, it seems like we do have more of a negative connotation to this verse. Whereas in the first instance, this gift pacified anger, and in the second instance, this reward is producing strong wrath. Pacification to the production. Now I'll return to reward in a moment, but I think we have to understand its relatedness, I think, to a degree, at least from my mind, to enter into this illustrative landscape once again. That although, much like a gift, we can see this in a positive light, the connotation of the verse is inherently negative. And just as we can imagine a reward that is given properly, I think we can imagine that a reward is given to somebody that ought not to have been given that reward. Perhaps their service, their efforts, or their achievements were not worth the reward that was given. Today, in the United States, in 2024, we are engaged in this strange cultural battle. And I think it has a lot to do with the second half of this verse. It has a lot to do with children. It has a lot to do with people in their work environments. It has a lot to do with institutions. It has a lot to do with people that belong to certain institutions that are rewarded for their efforts that ought not to be, and the consequences that follow from that. I think packed within this verse, certainly within the inversion with respect to the image that is above the water, we will find a lot of useful information, not only about the inversion, how one potentially good thing, if related to something else in a particular way, can lead to a bad outcome, but how this is also mirrored or paralleled with our contemporary culture. So now it seems as though this reward that has been given is misplaced, unlike the first verse, in which the gift that is given is properly placed. So back to this reward. A thing given in recognition for one's service, effort, or achievement. It is a thing given. Again, just like the first verse, it is a transfer of relationship from one person to another. A transfer of property, we can think about it in a number of ways in which one could be related to something that is given. Of the thing that is given, I think we can imagine all sorts of different types of characteristics that come into play here. We can imagine an idea that is given as a reward, or a piece of advice that is rewarding, or a thank you could be a reward, or a job well done, or an I love you, or a physical object can be a reward. Money can be a reward. Time can be a reward in which somebody is given a break for their hard work. There are many different types of rewards out there, and we are related to these rewards in different ways. But I would like to imagine and throw us back into the illustrative landscape that I had started in the first verse. As these cars are moving back and forth between the heart and the reasonable structure of mind. We can imagine two buildings that represent this, perhaps, that are separated by some distance. We have many different emotions that run back and forth. We have emotions that are paired with reason. We have emotions that are not paired with reason. It's difficult to say if there can be a reasonable driver without an emotion. Well, surely there can be. Perhaps there's an emotion that is following it quickly behind its tail to catch up to it, but the reason is trying to keep it at bay such that it is able to overcome the emotion to do the reasonable thing. Whether good or bad, doesn't matter. Again, we are just trying to imagine the landscape, the illustrative landscape for what can be. A reward in the bosom, strong wrath. So again, a thing that is given, a transfer of relationship. It is done in recognition. Now, for one to give a gift, surely there is a recognition involved. A reward, again, can be a type of gift. But perhaps it would be improper to say that a reward is a gift. Perhaps it is a gift in certain situations. It's difficult to say, perhaps. Now, if we are to imagine this landscape again, of this back and forth, of the various nervous impulses that are moving to and fro, some are carrying our emotions, some in surely quite sophisticated ways, through more than one neural pathway, our thoughts, our reason, our string of thoughts that allows us to perceive something as connected and continuous, and from some causal origin. Zipping past one another, interacting with one another. Surely it's easier to see as a two-way road, in which cars are moving east and some cars are moving west. Now, where is this reward? Where does it come down? Where does it intersect this infrastructure? In some sense, it's difficult because a reward is something that is given to the unification of the various elements that we are trying to consider. But surely, if a reward is bestowed upon the unification of all those various intricate neural interactions, and it can be perceived responded to on that level. Surely there is an effect among its elements. Of the elements, this bosom that I'm taking to mean the seat of our desires, it is an analogy to the heart. Much like in the previous, the first half of the verse, in which anger is an outgrowth of the heart. This bosom now we refer to as the heart. We're getting to the heart of it. We're getting to the base of it. The fundament. A reward in the bosom strong wrath. So let's say we take another car. I am now this reward instead of this gift. I come down, and what do I see? What do I want to do? Now it is not my goal to pacify anger, but rather, it is my duty, my mission, to find the bosom and place myself there. My goal is to recognize something. Perhaps my mission in terms of recognition has already been done. And now I am traveling. I've been accepted into the system, and now I'm traveling to this destination, which is the bosom. How is one to say? But if we are considering that the reward is bestowed upon the whole, just like rain falls upon a vast landscape, for which one person will be just as affected as another, we must examine it in that manner, and not necessarily as something has already occurred and now we are thinking downstream. I think we will get lost in that aspect, in that perspective. And so we have to remember, although it took me a while to get at it in the first instance, that there was an alteration in some relationship. And so here we have a relationship between the heart and strong wrath, not just wrath, but the adjective strong is placed by it, which we will get into. Right now I am this agent within this landscape. I am the reward. And perhaps I've made a mistake. Perhaps I am giving myself to something that I ought not to give myself to. I am attempting to enter into a sacred place, and my presence there is nothing but destructive. I am sort of like a cancer, inadvertently so. I don't mean to do it, perhaps. Perhaps I mean to do it, and because of my care, my desire to help, my desire to give, perhaps my selfish desire to want to be appreciated or want to be thanked, this wanting and longing for one's gratitude? It's difficult to say. But again, I am this reward, and I am in this world in which the cars are moving to and fro. And as I come down as this sort of spiritual figure upon this material landscape, I observe these cars passing by, and I skip over all of them. And I go to that main structure for which they are entering and leaving. The structure is the bosom. It is the heart. It is the seat of desire and feelings, emotions. And the vast sub-neural architecture that represents this structure. And I go to it and I say, I have something for you. And it's quite a strange thing to do. For just a moment ago, in the first half of the verse, we were talking about interacting with individual feelings and individual thoughts. Now we are attempting to interact with something that is the producer of those feelings and interacting with those thoughts. As I've said before in many verses, that the heart has a will of its own, not necessarily the same as the will of man. That again is this sort of conglomeration between the reasonable aspect and the feeling or experiential aspect. But if we were to separate them out, that causal will and then the feeling will certainly I have said is something that exists, and I've represented it as something like the will that can find a man, that can grip a man by his feelings before his reason catches him. Low-hanging fruit that would illustrate this would be fear. That would be something that tunes us into the environment that the rational mind has not picked up on. Danger, I think, is a big example, is an easy example to understand. That of seeing a predator, whether it be a man or an animal. Perhaps we don't see the man or the animal, but we can hear it, or we can feel its presence. That's sometimes that strange perception that man can get that seems to be beyond his vision or his hearing, and yet we know that something's a little bit off. That sort of thing we are clued into by feelings more than we are by our reason. And that's not to say, of course, that we cannot be clued into these things by our reason before our feelings. Surely many things that are dangerous we examine causally before the anxiety and the fear builds up in us. But then again, as I've said, what we are thinking about now is the will of the heart. So it's the reverse. We are thinking about those feelings that build up in us before that causal, rational aspect has found us, has entered into that relationship with the heart. And so again, instead of talking about the individual feelings, which we will in a moment, we are interacting with the producer. And we have to contend with the will itself, that will of the heart itself. And so I myself, this spiritual figure, is coming into this, perhaps we can imagine it as an industrial building, a factory that is producing these emotions. But it's not just a factory. It's an organization. It is something that has a president. It has a centralizing aspect that would represent this will. And so we have to think about this interaction in such a way. We have to think and consider that we can interact with the heart at the level of that CEO or president, or we could think about it that we can interact with it at the level of the emotion. Perhaps, in this case, as independent of reason, which we will come to. So to rewind, I have assumed this spiritual body. I am coming down to communicate with the CEO or the president or the will of the heart. Reward in the bosom. And so I'm in his office. Again, I am a reward. So I am here to give him something. But as I look around this room, I ask myself, well, what should I give him? I'm looking around and I'm seeing different things, and I recognize that my purpose is to give him something for something that he has done, for some effort or some achievement, something that he has made. I look around at his factory and I see that he makes emotions. Perhaps I look out the office window at the factory floor and I see that there is quite intense emotions. And I think to myself, well, if he's making such things, surely intensity means quite a lot. Intensity is an amplifier to our experience. We are experiential beings. Surely I ought to give him a reward for intense feelings. Now keep in mind that I am within the heart. I am in a place where reason cannot penetrate in the totalizing sense. Reason and emotion surely can find each other and articulate and form relationships. But in this place, they do not meet. It is pure emotion. And I am seeking at this moment, because I have been called to do so, to give a reward, to recognize something. Again, I am giving something. I am transferring some relationship. I'm altering a relationship. Because of an effort that the CEO or the president or the will of the heart is making. A reward in the bosom, strong wrath. And so I see this wrath, and I think to myself, wow. I think there are two potential paths that we can go down here. One path, one potential path, is that I, this spiritual figure, this reward, has seen wrath in a vehicle in relationship to reason before I had entered this factory, and I had formed an opinion, an a priori opinion. But perhaps I'm not using that word correctly, or perhaps I am. What I mean by that is to say, although there is some observation, I am approaching this with witnessing something independent of the heart, and I'm logically thinking to myself, well, if this result is from the heart, and I am appreciating the intensity of this thing, and I want to reward the system that had produced this, then I should go to the source. But perhaps there is a mistake, and perhaps this is where I may or may not be using a priori correctly, that I have some understanding, some hypothesis, perhaps some theory, by which I am deducing that it is a good thing to reward what I have observed come out of that factory, albeit it is in relationship to reason here in this vehicle before I have even entered the factory. But again, I am deducing that it is good by virtue of intensity alone, perhaps. That it is something that ought to be recognized. Now, wrath is a form of extreme anger. In the first part of that of this verse, anger was something that was, because of its attachment and its relationship to reason, that there was some fundamental component beneath it that was that sense of, that irritability, that was accompanied by some justification that caused it to be anger. Wrath, I think, is similar, but we have to ask the question, well, how is it an extreme form of that? Well, I think it would be based on the level or degree of justification, such that perhaps there is a greater degree of certainty, such that one is now wrathful rather than just angry. And because of that, this relationship is so much stronger. It's much, much harder than the first instance in which I was this police officer of a gift. I came in and I arrested, or I had stopped this erratic driver, this anger. And I had separated the two, the justification or the reason, and then the irritability or the opposition, that base desire, that base sense, that base feeling. Now we see an entirely different situation unfolding. I have made some judgment. I have decided to give a reward to the will of the heart. By making such a mistake, to pass over an extremely tight and bonded reason with this emotion, this base emotion. And what I'm rewarding here is more of the foundation. I'm rewarding opposition and I'm rewarding irritability. I'm doing the opposite, because in the first instance I arrested opposition and irritability, and now I'm rewarding it from the heart. A reward in the bosom strong wrath. Strong, I think, is because of the reward. It is reinforced. This irritability, this opposition, is reinforced by me. That it is recognized as something that is good. And what I have done is I've changed the relationship of the heart's output. The will of the heart now is oriented to experience goodness through opposition and irritability. And because of the rational component and that vast neural sub-architecture is now considering some justification for anger. Perhaps somebody that they love has been murdered and they want revenge. I have rewarded this heart for a false good, and I'm providing all of the soil of experience through these feelings for reason to grab onto it and proliferate its justification, or perhaps lack thereof. Because surely it could be wrong. Our reasoning could be wrong. And it grows strong, this wrath. And the moral here is that there was a false relationship that was formed between the base feeling and the justification, that the heart was rewarded in a manner that it should not have been. And I have to wonder, this vengeance must be part of it, this retribution, the killing of a man in retribution of another. Perhaps there is justice in some of this, but through wrath and through anger, a difficult situation. Surely there are better and more sophisticated situations that I can imagine than death, and such a low-hanging fruit to use. A reward in the bosom strong wrath. There is that implication that the reward is misplaced because of the strong wrath. Again, that reinforcement of the improper placing of the reward, which is that transfer of relational, the transfer of relationships, such that the CEO of the heart is now being subsidized to produce opposition and irritability. And perhaps the reward is there because of the reason. Surely one can reward the self. One may do something that they feel is... They may achieve something that they feel is worth celebrating, like having... I had a friend the other day that passed a major exam, and he sent a picture of this whiskey that he was going to drink in celebration. And he was rewarding himself. He was going to satisfy his heart through his reason, that through the consumption of that alcohol he would feel a particular way. And so one must wonder, the reward from without or the reward from within. I suppose it doesn't matter too much. It's interesting to reflect on both situations. But I'm now I'm thinking, considering more, that this verse may be sort of an internal reward, such that the reason is giving the will of the heart. It is communicating. The will of the reason is communicating to the will of the heart. And it is convincing it to produce that base substrate upon which that reason can grow. It can be supported, and it can be acted on. It could be experienced in the world. Again, I think we can imagine this both happening from within, but also from without, as I've mentioned in my case, that I am the reward, me, entering into somebody, you, the listener, and influencing the heart in this way. And then perhaps by producing these emotions, whatever justification happens to be there within reason, it finds that irritable, oppositional substrate, and it just sort of grows from there. I had an experience today of quite an oppositional person, very difficult for me to deal with, very difficult for me to justify. But within him, I think I saw much of this process occurring. That there was a strong heart, and his reason was quite antagonistic. It was quite contrary. It was constantly feeding off of itself, and it took a lot of energy for me to try and come between that self-rewarding behavior. Now, in this situation, I was trying to be a gift, such that I could separate that reason from the false emotion. But perhaps this feedback loop was occurring within him, internally. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with verse 15.